Hello, welcome to our December 13th webinar. We're going to get started. Thank you for joining us. Today's webinar is an overview of the federal compliance requirements for the Green Bank's recently released RFP for solar projects at affordable multifamily housing sites. I'm Emily Basham. I'm an Associate Director on the Financing Programs team at the Connecticut Green Bank. And I will be joined by my colleague, Stephanie Keohane. She's an Associate Director for implementation of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund here at the Connecticut Green Bank. And I'll also be joined by my colleague, Brian Farnan, who's the Green Bank's General Counsel and Chief Legal Officer. Next slide. For today's agenda, we'll do an introduction and overview of the RFP. Then I'll turn it over to my colleagues to provide information on the compliance requirements associated with using greenhouse gas reduction funds, which we'll refer to as GGRF. We'll specifically walk through the primary components of this compliance, which is Davis-Bacon and related acts, Build America, Buy America Act, and disadvantaged business enterprises. Then we'll move to our Q&A portion. We ask that attendees use the Q&A feature on the Teams toolbar to submit questions. Please feel free to submit your questions throughout this presentation, and at the end, we will answer all of the questions that we are able to. There will likely be some questions that we're not able to answer or need to consult other resources. So any remaining questions we will collect and answer at a later date. This webinar is being recorded. The recording, the slides, and the question log will be posted on our website along with the rest of the materials associated with this RFP. Next slide. All right, a quick introduction to the Connecticut Green Bank. We are a quasi-public state agency and the nation's first state-level green bank. We were established by the legislature in 2011 with the mission to confront climate change by accelerating investment in Connecticut's green economy. We do that by leveraging limited public dollars to attract private dollars into green investments. These investments are channeled through our financing products and programs. Next slide. One of our programs is the Solar Marketplace Assistance Program, referred to as Solar MAP, where we provide no-cost technical assistance to affordable multifamily housing providers, municipalities, and state agencies to navigate the solar and storage marketplace. Solar MAP provides product development services, financing, and coordinates the incentives and contractors. Through Solar MAP, we are working directly with property owners to identify sites and do technical diligence to determine feasible solar projects. And property owners select those sites they want to move forward with, and then the Green Bank team aggregates those projects into portfolios and then issues a request for proposals from our contractor network to build projects. So you'll see here our RFP schedule for the current solicitation for our portfolio. We've recently released a request for proposals. This is for EPC services, engineering, procurement, and construction services. Next slide, please. This is our first portfolio of solar projects that's located at affordable multifamily housing sites in Connecticut. As mentioned, we're working directly with the property owners through MAP to facilitate these installations. We will procure EPC services for the portfolio and enter into EPCAs with the awardee or awardees. We will also look to execute site lease agreements or solar loans with the affordable multifamily property owners. In Connecticut, the definition of a residential customer is now expanded to qualified affordable multifamily housing sites, and they are able to access the residential tariff through the utilities tariff program, the Residential Renewable Energy Solutions Program, or RRES. All the sites in this solicitation qualify as eligible affordable multifamily, and they have been developed to participate in RRES and be constructed according to the RRES program rules for affordable multifamily. Specifically, that they are front of the meter projects and that they are accessing the buy all, sell all tariff. The state of Connecticut is a recipient of the greenhouse gas reduction funds, and the Connecticut Green Bank is a subrecipient of those awards. So we are looking to deploy these funds to support the projects that are in this portfolio. This means that we are soliciting 2 bids through this RFP. We're requesting a secondary pricing bid that incorporates the requirements associated with the use of GGRF funds, and also a pricing bid without those federal compliance funds. Next slide. Proposers are not required to submit a secondary bid. So to repeat, bidders can participate in this RFP by submitting just 1 bid without pricing the considerations for federal compliance. However, priority will be provided to proposers whose submissions include a bid with federal compliance requirements. We recognize that project costs will likely be higher to meet the federal compliance requirements that we'll review today. These higher costs will not be penalized in the RFP scoring. Instead, Green Bank will evaluate the increased cost alongside the financial benefits that are offered by using GGRF funds, with a preference for projects that can meet the federal compliance requirements but still deliver the same or better financial benefits to the property owner and tenants as one that doesn't meet the federal compliance requirements. So please note, with this RFP solicitation, secondary bids are strongly encouraged but optional. We do ask that if a proposer is unable to meet the federal compliance requirements and submit a secondary bid, that you include the reason why in your proposal. We welcome and encourage as much detail and feedback from proposers on particular components of this compliance that present a barrier. On the slide here, you'll see the table of projects that are included in this solicitation, and highlighted below are the projects we are requesting secondary pricing. So 5 out of the 9, about 1 megawatt of the 2 megawatt portfolio, we are requesting secondary bids for. So that is the overview of our portfolio and our RFP. So now I'll turn it over to Stephanie to run through our federal compliance requirements.
Thanks, Emily, and thanks for everyone joining this afternoon and interest in this RFP and learning more about the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, or GGRF, and the associated federal requirements. So Emily touched on it a little bit, but I wanted to start off by just level setting with a quick overview of what is the GGRF that we keep referring to, and kind of what's Connecticut's role and the Green Bank's role in Connecticut in accessing those federal funds. So as you may know, the Inflation Reduction Act established the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which is a $27 billion investment series of programs to mobilize financing and private capital to deploy clean energy projects nationally. This program is administered by the EPA, and the GGRF actually consists of 3 different award competitions: the National Clean Investment Fund, or NCIF, which is a $14 billion award competition, the Solar for All award, which is total $7 billion, and the Clean Communities Investment Accelerator, which is a $6 billion competitively award program, or CCIA. The Green Bank was a part of applications or subrecipient in 2 of the 3 GGRF awards. And so we're pleased to report that over $100 million in federal GGRF funds have been awarded to Connecticut through NCIF, and as well as our Connecticut Solar for All application. A tenet of the GGRF program overall is emphasizing deployment in clean energy products and what the federal government term has used as low income and disadvantaged communities, or LIDACs for short. These communities have been historically underrepresented nationally in clean energy project installations. And I will just note that the definition of the federal LIDACs does include the portfolio of projects that Emily just went over on the affordable multifamily properties. So that would meet the definition and therefore be a qualified project under the consideration of GGRF. Overall, the Solar Maps multifamily program is for solar and storage is targeting opportunities to serve in communities that are defined as federally LIDAC communities, and thereby enables these communities to benefit from the clean energy deployments through the federal funds. As I mentioned, all states were awarded Solar for All funding. Connecticut's share of that award is $62.5 million. The lead recipient there is the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. The Green Bank, other state agencies, and other quasi-publics in the state are working together on implementation. In addition to Solar for All, the Green Bank secured federal funding for Connecticut under a winning NCIF award led by the Coalition for Green Capital, and that was for approximately $41 million. And again, the affordable multifamily kind of portfolio through Solar Map is a large component of our implementation plans for both NCIF and Solar for All. I think we can move to the next slide. Thanks. So as Emily mentioned, this presentation today is going to kind of focus on 3 aspects of federal GGRF compliance requirements. But like other federal, funding programs, there's a series of kind of terms and conditions that require compliance for recipients, subrecipients such as the Green Bank, and then funding that ultimately for projects, which some of those requirements flow down to contractors, hence kind of the topics here today. So we wanted to take some time today to highlight a few of these requirements to hopefully assist proposers in incorporating relevant pricing and other considerations into their bid submissions for this RFP, should you opt to provide secondary bid pricing, and we hope that you do. Additional information I wanted to highlight too, aside from this webinar, are specified in the RFP in various places. So keep a lookout for Exhibit G, which is kind of a recap of these key federal compliance requirements, as well as in Exhibit C, which is the EPC template agreement. There's a Schedule 22 that has much more details than are covered in this slide. Also just wanted to include a disclaimer note here that the information contained in the presentation and topics discussed today are based on the Green Bank's current knowledge of the program parameters and requirements established by the EPA, and that this presentation should not be taken as legal or regulatory advice, and that if needed, consult with your own counsel, and to just kind of acknowledge that the EPA is kind of tweaking some of its terms and conditions around federal compliance requirements, so that to the extent that anything kind of changes or evolves, we're certainly going to stay on top of that and make you all aware if there are any changes that are relevant as well. Next slide, please. So we're first going to kind of dive into the topic of Davis-Bacon and related acts. You might hear DBRA or DB kind of referred to for short. I'll note that some of these slides I've included are pretty text heavy, including this one, but I did want to just have it as a resource for folks that can be kind of go back and reference. And we did mention too that this webinar will be recorded. So just as kind of a frame of context, you might be familiar already, but the Davis-Bacon kind of requirement and concept has been in place actually for almost a century. It's not a new federal requirement, and it's not something that is brought about for the first time through the GGRF program. It has been applied in other industries to date, but I do think it's perhaps newer to some entities within the clean energy industry, and so we're all learning about it together. But essentially what it breaks down to is it's a series of acts, as implied by the name, that requires contractors and their subcontractors to pay locally prevailing wages as well as fringe benefits, and we can get into more of that detail on the next slide, to certain classes of laborers and mechanics that perform work at the site of work, and that this providing the prevailing wages must be done on a weekly basis. So one of the key terms that we've been unpacking here is a public building or public work. So the Davis-Bacon Act applies to construction, alteration, and repair of a public building or public work that's financed in part or in whole with federal funds. So we've confirmed our understanding that Davis-Bacon in this instance of the portfolio of projects does apply. I will say that the site of work does not include like a permanent office location or kind of anything outside of the site of work when you're determining the affected laborers that would be impacted by a Davis-Bacon requirement. The wage determinations that are set by the federal government have 4 different types of construction and therefore details about hourly wages and fringe rates. These projects in this portfolio fall under the residential construction category, as that is defined, I think, by the Department of Labor, of single family homes and apartments up and including to 4 stories. A couple other additional aspects to be aware of contracts over $100,000 require contractors to comply with overtime provisions. And there's a separate act that kind of specifies what those are, as well as, protections against contractors inducing employees to kind of otherwise not comply essentially with these prevailing wage and requirements. Next slide, please. So now to get into the specifics a little bit for the counties in Connecticut, where the 5 projects that Emily listed on the slide and that are highlighted in the RFP are. So for those who are not familiar, essentially a wage determination is a set of wages, fringe benefits, and associated rules that are established by the U.S. Department of Labor and is established as a prevailing wage for a given kind of labor category or classification in a given county. So we've highlighted the information from available at sam.gov. Anyone can kind of find this information for relevant areas. And the projects in this portfolio, at least, are in New Haven and Tolland counties. So as you can see in the columns, the wage determination is comprised of a rate, a base rate and a fringe rate, so that workers, as our understanding, must receive kind of the equivalent of those rates combined. Fringe rates or fringe benefits rather can be inclusive of a number of different types of benefits: paid time leave, health insurance, any life insurance, retirement contributions, and that this fringe, if it's not provided already in other benefits, can be provided as a cash equivalent that is acceptable under the Davis-Bacon laws. Again, this table is specific to this portfolio and is our kind of best understanding of the relevant classifications. Should there be any kind of questions or other requests, I would definitely include that in your RFP bid materials. But you can find this slide as well in Exhibit G of the RFP. Next slide. Great. So I think this is probably what folks are actually interested in, is like, as a contractor, if the Davis-Bacon project is selected, or a project that Davis-Bacon is required is selected, like what do I need to do to comply? And so this is kind of separating it to different pieces of the process. So on the front end, in the bid process, to respond obviously to any RFP or other solicitations as accurately as you can, and to incorporate required Davis-Bacon terms and conditions language in any flowing down subcontracts. And that specific language is included in the RFP exhibits that I mentioned. So it's kind of this an easy copy paste of the relevant language. And this is a specific federal requirement. As I mentioned earlier, if there are any like changes that are required to the wage determination process to work with the Green Bank, there's a federal, they call conformance process to make those changes, but to kind of notify us is the first step. And then ensure no subcontractor is awarded as a debarred entity. There's a list of such entities on SAM.gov. On the implementation side, this is really the kind of core component of DBRA compliance, I would say, is paying covered workers and laborers on a weekly basis while construction is underway until project completion. And that these fringe benefits, while don't necessarily need to be paid on a weekly basis, have to be paid no more than or no less than quarterly, excuse me. So not only does the kind of weekly payroll need to take place, but what's called the certified payroll report or submissions, those must also be submitted weekly. And in this case, the contractor will be responsible for submitting those for their workers as well as on behalf of the subcontractor to the Green Bank. We would be the contracting agency under these provisions, and then we have our own reporting requirements, which I get into a little bit on the next slide. But in terms of the submitting weekly certified payroll submissions, there's also a requirement about storing such submissions for a period after the construction is complete. And then there's signage language that Department of Labor has that just needs to be provided and posted on the project site. Next slide. If you're interested to, I should note that like what specifics are required within that weekly certified payroll report, that information and language is specified in Exhibit C of the RFP and specifically Schedule 22. So I think it's the last schedule of that document, if that's of interest in looking over. So from the Green Bank's side, I mentioned as a contracting agency, this kind of just summarizes kind of our relationship with contractors, and then a relationship as a subrecipient of a federal award, and any obligation to kind of report to federal agencies if violations occur, things like that. I don't think I need to go over all of these sub-bullet points, but they're here for reference. I will just highlight that the Green Bank intends to procure a third-party DBRA compliance solution provider. So that would essentially work with the contractors and their, depending on their payroll system, kind of work directly through that in order to kind of make as seamless as possible this weekly certified payroll submission process. So we're committed to working with our contractor network as we meet those requirements. And so we'll be planning to bring on a third party to assist kind of both sides on that in that transaction. Okay, next slide, please. Moving on to the next kind of federal requirement that we wanted to walk through in a little bit greater detail, Build America, Buy America Act, also referred to as BABA, you might hear. This was first enacted as part of the 2021 Infrastructure and Investment and Jobs Act. It does build upon pre-existing kind of federal domestic sourcing requirements for infrastructure projects supported by other federal funds. So again, it's kind of an expansion into the clean energy industry, but otherwise the concepts have been for other types of federal projects, not new. The key here is kind of how infrastructure is defined for a given project and whether those projects meet the public function test. So again, we've looked at this in the context of our affordable multifamily housing portfolio. And it's our understanding from EPA that since the Green Bank will ultimately own the energy generating assets in this portfolio, if GGRF funds are utilized, the project is considered publicly owned and operated. Therefore, the Build America, Buy America requirements would apply in this case. Next slide. So what are the Build America, Buy America requirements? This three categories on the column on the left: iron and steel, manufactured products, and construction materials are the umbrella terms or categories, and then the definitions on the right-hand side of this table kind of discuss in detail what that means. I will note solar panels is included as an example of manufactured products. There are others that are likely BABA that trigger BABA applicability as part of these projects, but we wanted to just provide this as a table. There's also more information in the RFP in terms of federal agency resources about what applies if there is interest in learning more as you put together your bid responses. I think we can go to the next slide. And this is kind of more of just for reference. What BABA does not apply to in terms of materials, it would be temporary items that would be removed prior to project completion. So this is kind of a carve out, I would say, from some of the construction materials. You can see cement, aggregate, some other materials are not subject to BABA, as well as services that may be part of the overall construction project or getting to project construction and completion. There are other project types within kind of the sphere of GGRF. If you're hearing about or potentially engaging in other federal funded requirements, for example, BABA we've learned does not apply or would not apply to privately owned single family residences or a privately owned manufacturing or industrial facility, unless such a facility is publicly accessible. This kind of goes back to those key definitions of infrastructure and what meets kind of the public function test. If it does not meet a public function test, then BABA essentially would not apply. But it's important to kind of understand on a case-by-case basis where the applicability lies. I think we can go to the next slide. Thanks. In terms of compliance for this requirement, it's important to just highlight here that prior to installation, the requirement is to have a signed certification letter that does come from the product manufacturer. And so this flowchart is kind of an example of how this would likely occur, that a product supplier would obtain that letter of certification for all BABA applicable materials from the manufacturers, but that the contractors are ultimately responsible for obtaining and maintaining that documentation. So the documentation it's not sourced from the contractor, but it's part of the compliance process. And that's something that, would need to be provided to the Green Bank. I think we can go to the next slide. Okay, so the third of the three topics that we wanted to highlight today is EPA's language around the utilization of disadvantaged business enterprises. Another acronym here is DBE. So according to EPA's definition here, how a disadvantaged business enterprise would be identified is if the entity is established, is owned and controlled with at least 51% ownership by socially and economically disadvantaged individuals who are citizens and are of good character. And so EPA has identified Asian Americans, Black Americans, disabled Americans, Hispanic Americans, Native Americans, and women are socially and economically disadvantaged individuals. And so your entity falls into any of those categories. We would ask that you provide this information as part of your bid response. In addition, we've identified, as EPA doesn't have, there isn't, as we're aware, a standard DBE certification from EPA at least, but they've kind of identified that there are other state and federal avenues for this. So, for example, in Connecticut, the Department of Administrative Services has a supplier diversity program. The Minority Business Enterprise certification within that supplier diversity program would constitute or would meet the threshold of EPA's kind of DBE consideration. So if, again, that applies to you, please let us, and you're planning to submit for GGRF, please just include that information in your application. The U.S. Small Business Administration also has a women-owned small business certification that, again, would meet this DBE definition. Next slide. We're getting to the end here. So another text-heavy slide, but I wanted to include, if it's helpful to refer back to. I think the takeaway here is that the EPA has established 6 good faith efforts for entities to engage with disadvantaged business enterprises by providing opportunities to participate in procurements, and that these 6 good faith efforts do apply, as we understand, to prime contractors. Again, this is under a scenario where GGRF funds are utilized. So there's language here, and I've highlighted some of whenever possible, posting solicitations for bids for a minimum of 30 calendar days. And, you know, if it's a large contract, providing opportunities for smaller subcontractors to do different parts of the work. I think there's some more information that we've included in the, again, referring back to the exhibit C and the RFP language about outreach efforts that are kind of seen as good faith efforts, just as examples, if that's helpful to reference. I think that next slide, please. I think that brings me to the end of the remarks that we wanted to share. As Emily mentioned, if you do have questions and haven't already, you could use the Q&A function to send them to us. I'm not seeing any so far, but we'll pause and give folks a few minutes if they do have questions. And again, the kind of next schedule of dates are also listed on the slide here. All questions about the RFP in general, as well as any GGRF requirements, responses or requests are due next Tuesday. And then responses will be posted after that and prior to the RFP submission date, which is January 13th. Just pause for a final opportunity for folks to ask any questions. Thanks again for bearing with us on a federal compliance webinar on a Friday afternoon. Appreciate the time and interest. I don't know, Emily, if you have any other closing remarks, but if not, I don't see any questions that we've gotten in the chat or in the Q&A.
Yeah, I think we've run through a lot of material. Thank you, Stephanie. A lot of the same material is in the exhibit to the RFP. So in addition to the recording of this webinar, you also have those reference materials in our RFP. You can see on the screen here the website to find our RFP and a contact email. So if questions aren't coming to you now or they arise as you're approaching the December 17th question deadline, please feel free to use that email address to submit any questions, GGRF or RFP related.
Great. And I'll just say thanks again, everyone. And we look forward to the questions that come in next week and then reviewing the RFP submissions next month.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.